Greetings, everyone. This is Pastor Mock, and this is now the third episode in our series on fear. Last time we looked at sinful fear, and now we are considering right fear. Again, going through, or at least I'm being inspired by Michael Reeves' book, Rejoice and Trembling. It's a good book on the topic, the surprising good news of the fear of the Lord. That's the subtitle. And this afternoon, looking at the issue of right fear, we need to get straight that there is a sense in which fear can be right. And the new covenant is full of this right fear. In fact, the fear of God is a blessing that attends the new covenant. We see this throughout Scripture, but just looking at a few passages here in Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 37 through 41, God says, I will bring them back to this place, and I will make them dwell in safety. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for their own good and the good of their children after them. I will make with them an everlasting covenant, that I will not turn away from doing good to them. And I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. I will rejoice in doing them good, and I will plant them in this land in faithfulness with all my heart and all my soul. So there you have God promising to return his people to a land of faithfulness, and he's going to give them this everlasting love. And inclusive of this everlasting love is a right fear. A fear that would cause them to remain steadfast in their love for God, that they would not turn away from God because they fear him rightly. They love him as they ought to. This is a new covenant blessing because of the goodness of God. Later on in Jeremiah, just the next chapter, verses 8 and 9, God says, I will cleanse them from all the guilt of their sin against me, and I will forgive all the guilt of their sin and rebellion against me. And this city shall be to me a name of joy, a praise and a glory before all the nations of the earth, who shall hear of all the good that I do for them. They shall fear and tremble because of all the good and all the prosperity I provide for it. So one consequence, a blessing of the forgiveness of the guilt and the rebellion against God is a godly fear, a godly trembling, as the people consider how good God has been to them, how prosperous they have been in the Lord. He cleanses them, he forgives them, he's good to them. And because of that, they have this fear. It's a right fear. Hosea 3:5 says, afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. So there we have an equivalence of fear to the Lord and goodness. We cannot say that right fear or that all fear of the Lord is stripped of goodness. Now, there's a sense in which the fear of the Lord is the goodness of the Lord, and the people are returning to the fear of the Lord. They're returning to the goodness of the Lord in these latter days. And those are Old Testament passages, and the same is the same reality we see in the New Testament. In Luke, for instance, in Luke chapter 7, Jesus raises the son of a widow, and in verses 14 through 16 it says, then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still, and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. And here's the response from the crowd. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people. This wasn't a terror. This was a right fear that seized them, that struck them, that captivated them because of the reality that God had visited them. God in the person of Jesus Christ. Returning to the Old Testament, you might remember from a couple videos ago that God is called the fear of Isaac. And if you chart Isaac's story from Genesis 21 down to 26, you see that Isaac was the object of so much grace. He was the child of the promise in Genesis 21. He was rescued by God in Genesis 22. He received a wonderful wife in 24, and he was blessed by God in 25. His wife Rebekah conceived in chapter 25 as well, and there was much land given to him, and he reaped 100-fold in chapter 26. So very quickly there we see how Isaac was supremely blessed by his God. This was not a terror that Isaac had of God. This was a right, reverential, but also joyful fear because of the goodness of God. Fear and love are in parallel. Sometimes people think that fear and love don't mix. One office manager was asked if he would prefer to be feared or loved, and he said both. He wanted people to be afraid of how much they loved him. Well, that's not exactly what's going on here in the Bible, but Psalm 145, 19 and 20 has a parallel of fear and love. It says that he fulfills the desires of those who fear him. He also hears their cry and saves them. And then here's verse 20, the parallel. The Lord preserves all who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. God fulfills the desires of those who love him. He preserves all who fear him. Or I got that mixed up. He fulfills the desire of those who fear him, and he preserves all who love him. Fear and love are seen together. If this is a right fear and a right love for God, they are to be seen as dual aspects of a heart that worships and loves God. There is a trembling in this right fear. So just because there's not a terror in right fear is not to say that there isn't a trembling. Reeves speaks of this as an intensity of our love and enjoyment of all that God is. As we contemplate the beauties and excellencies of God, there is to be a right quaking, a right trembling. Spurgeon says that a right fear falls on its face before the Lord, but it falls leaning toward God. Remember, a sinful fear is one that's so struck by with terror for God that he runs away from God. The sinner does. But rather, a right fear is falling down before God, toward God, in reverence and love, in joy, in faith in God. The fear of the Lord is that fear by which we are overwhelmed by the goodness of God, by the majesty of God, by the holiness of God, by the righteousness of God, by the grace of God. This is a right trembling. One illustration might be that right trembling that the bridegroom feels when he sees his bride for the first time coming down the aisle. I had that when I saw my wife, my soon-to-be wife, coming down the aisle. There was a right fear on my countenance, and I was beginning to tremble, not because I was afraid of her, but because of the weightiness of what was going to happen, and because of the joy and love that I have for my soon-to-be wife, just moments after she walked down that aisle. Fear and joy, again, some people think that these don't mesh well. They, again, eschew fear and love, and now they eschew fear and joy. But Reeves again says that the fear of the Lord is that the heart throbs with pleasure. The fear of the Lord is a pleasure. It is a joy. It is a delight to believers. Nehemiah 1:11 speaks of servants who delight to fear the Lord's name. In Psalm 2:11, we are commanded to rejoice with trembling. And in Matthew 28:8, two women who were leaving Jesus' tomb, they left with both fear and joy. There was a trembling, but a delight at the empty tomb that Christ was raised from the dead. It is a sheer intensity of the saints' happiness in God. And all of God draws out this fear and joy, this fear and love. So we mustn't overemphasize the holiness of God. We must emphasize, or we must take into account all of who God is. We should have a right fear when we consider the holiness of God and the majesty of God. But also, Reeves would say, and the Bible would say, we need to have this right fear when we consider the goodness of God, the forgiveness that we are granted from God, the greatness of God, the wisdom of God. Not just his majesty, not just his exaltation, but all that he is. So as we move forward, we'll see how we can cultivate this fear. But the next video, we'll look at us being overwhelmed by God as our creator. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.